Hello, everyone. Welcome to CAC meeting number 4 for Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles Master Plan. The topic for tonight is resilience. I am Jason Neighbor. I'm a biologist. I'm also the ecology practice lead at Emmons and Olivier Resources. We've been in the Twin Cities for about 20 years, and we provide water resources, natural resource services to a lot of clients throughout the upper Midwest. I'm happy to be on the 10 by 10 team for this project with Mara Rockcastle and Erica Christensen, and very grateful to be working for the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board on this project. I know you've had some previous CAC meetings where you discussed access and history, and obviously those are very important issues for the park. Tonight we're going to focus on resilience, and we'll go a little bit into historic context as it relates to natural resources, water quality, talk a little bit about the species composition within the park in terms of natural species, and then I'll talk a little bit about some opportunities, water quality related and other natural resource enhancement opportunities. Access is obviously a big issue with the park. I know a lot of discussion has been had thus far. I just wanted to bring this point about access to the natural areas because this park truly does provide some unique opportunities for folks to directly access some natural areas, both terrestrial and water. And this map shows a number of places where there are direct points of entry into these natural areas within the park. For a little historic context on the natural communities, we often look back at the pre-settlement vegetation maps. They're not very accurate necessarily, but they do provide us a good context for what was there pre-settlement. The darker green area is the big woods, and folks are probably a little familiar with that. We do have some remnant big woods communities left around the Twin Cities. Those are typically maple, basswood with some oak mixed in, large forest-grown trees. The lighter green oak openings and barrens, that's a little more open, woodland, prairie, savanna kind of mix of typically bur oaks, northern pin oaks, maybe some shrubs such as sumac, and then a pretty robust understory of grasses and forbs. Obviously, we have the lakes, and then a big component is the marshlands. And there were quite a few marshes in and around Cedar and Lake of the Isles, and not terribly unlike a lot of our wetlands in the state of Minnesota. Those were converted into different uses. And then down on the very southwest corner of the map, there's a little touch of prairie there. And we do have a little prairie on the Cedar Lake portion of this park, but it's not at all to the scale or size that once dominated our landscape here in Minnesota and into the west. In terms of the watershed itself, I mean, obviously pre-settlement, it was undeveloped, and historically, the wetlands that were in place and the forests really filtered a lot of water, provided a really enhanced opportunity for infiltration that feeds a lot of our water resources. One very notable point here is that this historic watershed divide shown in a bold blue line, Cedar Lake and Lake of the Isles were not in the same watershed. In fact, Cedar Lake drained north through Brownie into Bassett Creek, and Lake of the Isles to the south to Minnehaha Creek. And once that channel was cut between that, it obviously made a big change in terms of the contributing drainage area to Lake of the Isles. And there'll be another figure on that here in a moment. Other things going on early in the late 1800s, early 1900s is the development of the railroad. And as those rail lines were put in, there were certain portions of the lakes that needed to be filled to be developed or just simply to support the infrastructure. At the same time, there was some Lake of the Isles Boulevard and other roadways were being put in, and then some very noticeable dredging of some of the lakes, particularly Lake of the Isles in 1909. Both lakes were thought to be a little too marshy to incorporate into the city park system. So they went ahead and did some dredging out there, and really what they removed was what we call the littoral zone. And that's the emergent area where most of the vegetation grows in a lake. And so by dredging that out, you really are compromising the ecological integrity of the lake. Those aquatic plants provide much of the oxygenation needed to support fish, and then a lot of other wildlife habitat along the lakeshore. As development continued to occur, we got into the 50s through the 70s era, and there was a lot of infrastructure development, a lot of engineering, a lot of hardscapes, a lot of conduits, underground pipes. But basically, the goal was to direct water to and away from the lakes and away from any other sorts of residential or commercial uses. With that direct conduit of stormwater, water quality became a big problem, and there was a big explosion in aquatic vegetation growth, some algal blooms, reductions in clarity. There's also a really interesting history that of pumping and connections made, and very interesting that pumps were set up to basically pump water out of the lakes to augment Minnehaha Falls, and there was also pumps that could pump from Bassett Creek into the lakes, or even a pump that pumped water from the Mississippi River backwards up Bassett Creek in towards Brownie Lake. So that is really fascinating era of engineering feats, if you will. As we moved into the 1990s, a little more of a renaissance came about with interest in water quality, natural research projects. There was a Clean Water Partnership grant that was received in 1991, and that provided some very valuable funding. One project built around this era was the stormwater management project at Cedar Meadows, and that was obviously built to treat stormwater coming in from a large developed portion of the watershed and provide some treatment before it enters the lake. In 1996-97, there were alum treatments applied to the lakes. This would help improve water quality. I'll get into that in a little bit. The Eurasian water milfoil harvesting program started in earnest. And then we also had some flooding situations starting to happen a little more frequently. Just to expand a little on this watershed context, obviously, Cedar Lake and Lake of the Isles are in a highly urbanized watershed. And in order to make true improvements, work needs to occur within the watershed. And this map shows the project area in green here is a very small part of the overall watershed. And just to backtrack a bit on the Lake of the Isles, if you were to sort of look at this and say, well, what sort of nutrient loading was flowing into Lake of the Isles prior to the connection with Cedar, and you can see that its drainage area is quite small. And so when you look at an annual load perspective, there's a lot more water running through Lake of the Isles now than there were prior to that connection. I'm going to just talk a little bit of water quality data here, and this is special thanks to Rachel Crabb and her staff for compiling a lot of this for me to present to you. I'm going to just talk a little bit about this trophic state index, and it's just really a way to measure the quality and clarity of the water in a lake. And at the top of this chart is oligotrophic, which means it has very low biological productivity. You might say the water's clear. At the bottom of the chart, eutrophic, meaning a lot of nutrients, and in cases where you get big algal blooms and weed growth. And you can see on the left column here, both Cedar and Isle are indicated where they fall within this trophic state index. You'll note neither of those are meeting their goal. They're close, but they are definitely within the sort of scale or realm of other similar city lakes. Dive a little bit more into the data here. For Cedar Lake, it generally is not meeting its goal, as I mentioned. You can see here very profoundly in the red box that the alum treatment in 1997 did indeed reduce the TSI score. And I should mention in this chart, the TSI score, so better, is on the lower part of the scale. The previous chart had better at the top. But the way these data are presented, the lower the score is better in terms of water quality and clarity. And so you could see that the alum treatment had a good effect on water quality, water clarity, and then it slowly increased. And now if you look at the very current data sets, the 4 data points from 2017 on, we have really high TSI scores. And we don't really know exactly why that is, but we're speculating that some of the flooding issues probably brought more sediment into the lake, potentially some shoreline erosion, and then also just with more runoff carries a higher nutrient load over time into the lake. Cedar Lake has 3 beaches, and in that case, bacteria monitoring is very important. Each of these beaches are well below the MPCA standard for E. coli. And consequently, these standards are almost always met, and the beaches are very rarely closed. Now, Lake of the Isles is a little more schizophrenic in terms of its data points for TSI score. Similarly, in the 1997 period, you can see the effect that the alum treatment had on the lake, but then it didn't quite show that same trend like Cedar Lake, where it kind of slowly gained back higher TSI score. It was kind of all over the place. But you will notice that, 2017 on, those 4 data points again are well above kind of its standard. And so it is definitely on a path now recently of lower water quality and is considered a eutrophic lake. Mentioned flooding a little bit. Typically we use the 100-year flood as sort of what we use to judge size of storms. Certainly there are larger ones, but looking at the 100-year storm for Cedar Lake, there are impacts to recreational uses. And in one point here at the southwest corner, there's a section of the pedestrian trail that will be underwater at a 100-year flood event. Lake of the Isles didn't fare quite so well. There's a number of points here, trails along the lake that would indeed be inundated at the 100-year flood elevation. UR staff spent several days during the early and mid part of the growing season out and around Cedar and Lake of the Isles. Our inventory was pretty comprehensive, and what we provided to 10 by 10 and to Park and Rec Board is an online GIS map where they can access all of the data points that we collected out there. And that includes species, other comments, wildlife notes, and then also all of the photos or images that we took out in sort of the typical settings, kind of classify the community types are all hyperlinked. So if you access this website here, you can poke around in there. And so actually a pretty nice way to spend an afternoon poking around around the lakes and seeing some really nice scenery from the summer season. Soils is a big issue around the lake. There's actually very little area around the lake that the soil hasn't been disturbed in some way or another. The real dark brown areas are fill soils. So basically soils that were excavated and filled around the lake. And those typically are unstable. They're usually a wetland soil and they tend to subside over time or sink. And so that creates a little some of these rainwater depressions and things that you noticed around the parks. The fill soil and the cut and fill soil, those are just basically mixed up soils caused by different construction projects. And it's really profound when you get into some of these areas where you can clearly tell that the soils have been disturbed, and then you look around and there's really no signature canopy trees. So a lot of these areas are poor soils and they become colonized by Siberian elm and box elders and maybe some cottonwoods and other faster growing tree species. And then the understory is very poor quality just because the quality of the soil is such that it is. Overall, I mean, there's a good diversity of habitat out there. I mean, I hate to say there's no real high quality habitat areas. There's minimal, I would say. To me, it's kind of taking a tour of all the areas. The prairie along the north side of Cedar is really quite exceptional, and especially in some places. There's a really good diversity of forbs, grasses, and not a lot of invasive species in parts of it. So um, really nice work to folks who are managing that. And that's a really nice plant community. Some of our forests are for the most part, altered. There are some nice little remnants of maple basswood and some oak woodland, but a lot of them, unfortunately, are pretty heavily invaded by buckthorn and other invasive species. And good news is folks are out working on that, and that's certainly the right thing to do to keep those plant communities healthy. There are some high quality plant species out there, and these are species that, are often found in very diverse native plant communities where they can be indicators of high quality habitats. I mean, in this case, we have some really nice species out there, not necessarily indicative of a high quality habitat in this case, but really nice remnants like large sugar maples, silver maples, a whole suite of oaks, particularly some massive bur oaks on some of the more open grown areas, really majestic, nice trees. The hackberries and basswoods on some of the big woods remnants within the park. The forbs and grasses along the railroad line or the trail on the north side of Cedar, really nice. I just listed a few here that were kind of surprising to see, and really enjoyed seeing the butterfly milkweed and the blazing stars in bloom and the monarchs out there. And just really a nice setting. And the grasses were growing strong, robust, the big blue stem, little blue, Indian grass, side oats grama. I think there was a June grass too. So really good diversity. In terms of aquatic plants, we did do some survey work within the lake and, found some really nice species, white lotus, some three square rush, white stem pondweed, many others, of course, but there is a nice diversity of plant species within the lakes. I dove into this bird list a little bit. The Minnesota Ornithological Union has a website where you can query out all the birds that have been identified at these parks. And so we ran lists for Cedar and Lake of the Isles, and Cedar had 160 different species of birds, and Cedar or Lake of the Isles had 163 species. So we just sort of characterized or classified them here in groups. No way to list out all 160 plus species, but I guess the point of this slide is that there's species here that inhabit many different niches within the park. So we have, waterfowl or aquatic species, semi-aquatic, woodland, even some prairie species, all represented within the park. And, not all of these are residents, meaning they live here year round. Some just pass through on their migrations north or south. Some migrate here to nest and to breed, and then they go back to warmer climes in the winter. But really a nice mix of bird species out there. While we were out doing our work, we didn't do a full survey or anything, but certainly jotted down notes of things that we encountered along the way. A pretty good bird list developed in terms of just mostly residents and some breeding residents. A couple mammals, no shock there, chipmunk, gray squirrel. Saw a couple turtle species and some frogs. I just want to mention fish. I mean, I did see some sunfish as I was walking along the shoreline, but the lakes do support a pretty good assemblage of both game and non-game fish. And one non-game fish to note is this least darter. It's a special concern species and actually pretty cool to have in the chain lakes. Invasive exotic species. These are just simply species that displace native species, and they reduce the ability of the plant community to support native fish and wildlife. This is a definition from Minnesota DNR, and there certainly is no shortage of these within the park. Notably within the forested areas, we have the Tatarian honeysuckle, white mulberry, both species of buckthorn, both glossy and common. Also a lot of Siberian elm within the forested areas, and also that same species, Siberian elm, is really creeping into that real nice prairie on the north side. And folks are certainly managing that, but that is a big job. Other species in the prairie that are invasive, spotted knapweed. There are some thistles out there as well and some vetches, but spotted knapweed was probably one of the bigger ones. For the aquatics and semi-aquatics, narrowleaf cattail, which isn't a surprise, that's pretty ubiquitous here around the Twin Cities. Common reed, there's one patch of that on the south side of Isles that looks like folks have been working on that, but there is a very invasive hybrid of this common reed that is found on within the park. And then a couple of the aquatics that people are familiar with as aquatic invasive species, the Eurasian water milfoil and curly pondweed are in the lakes. This concept of out of place species, this is something we sort of said, well, you know, they're not invasive. They just aren't necessarily from this particular area. Things like European larch, Scotch pine, ginkgo, buckeye, locust trees. And Park and Rec Board has system-wide goals for species diversity and intentionally mixes native and non-native or naturalized tree species to fit with, you know, sort of climate resiliency. And some of these species, you know, are really great wildlife benefit great. The wildlife benefit from these considerably. These would be things like ornamentals that like flowering crabs and other kinds of things that both produce a flower for pollinators, but also a fruiting berry for birds and other things. I also just wanted to mention ornamentals in terms of sort of urban escapees, things like snow on the mountain, Japanese knotweed that people have in their yards. They escape and they start to colonize areas of the park. I also, as I was kicking around there, I stumbled across a whole patch of cactus, which certainly I did not expect to find there, but most likely was transplanted from somebody's home that they didn't want it there anymore and they wanted to give it a new place to live. So things like that are certainly out of place, if you will. Talk a little bit about opportunities, certainly in terms of habitat enhancements. A lot of things could be done out in the park in terms of in-lake work for fish, pollinator habitat, even some terrestrial or avian habitat, nesting boxes, things like that for birds. Restoring ecological function, you know, activities like invasive species management, restoring native ground cover, converting turf grasses into native perennial plant species, grasses, forbs, things like that. I'll expand a little bit more on stormwater, flood control, and water quality management ideas in these next couple slides. So for example, along the lakes and, you know, in areas, there is certainly an opportunity to build in some diverse native buffers. So if you look at this example, I think this was from Phelan in St. Paul, but they've, you know, done a lot of work to establish native upland buffers along the lakes wherever they could do it. This provides, you know, great habitat, obviously, but also some good stormwater filtering. Another thing to think about is maybe, you know, defining access points around the lake. So, you know, instead of having people build or make their own dirt trails down to the lake that are prone to erosion and contributing sediment and nutrients to the lake, maybe developing a few stabilized access points where folks could get down, access the lake for fishing or just simply to get down and sit and look at the lake, get closer to it. A lot of opportunity for stormwater management. In terms of rain gardens, we also looked at, you know, a lot of these areas that I described before where the soil has subsided or sank, if you will. there's some opportunity to create some pocket wetlands out there. These are areas that are difficult to maintain because they stay wet frequently. And so, converting those over to a sort of native garden, if you will, would reduce maintenance and also provide some habitat and enhance aesthetics a little bit. The woodland restoration I mentioned before is a big effort. It starts from, establishing proper canopy trees and then all the way down to the ground cover layer. In some cases, there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of kind of getting that back on a better path with more natives and minimizing those invasive species. And then just a turf conversion in areas where the turf isn't being used or it's relatively unusable. Think about converting those over to a perennial grass and forb mix that provides some pollinator habitat, provides forage for a lot of bird species, especially in the fall with all those seeds, and then enhance some aesthetics of the area. One thing we'll get a little more into in the as we move along here, but we want to start thinking a little bit about, well, what are the types of features that can be built out there or activities we can do that would really provide some water quality benefits? And, keep in mind that we really need to look outside and work with our watershed partners to make big differences, but there are some things within the park that could provide some minor water quality benefits, and would want to kind of take a look at it like this example where let's say, well, let's take stormwater rain gardens at the top there. Yes, they're relatively expensive compared to the others, but the treatment potential provided is probably better than, say, a simple turf conversion, for example. So this is just an example, kind of gives our kind of rough opinion on how things are shaking out. But obviously, as we look into more options and what things work and where, we can start to think this through a little bit more carefully and make good, sound decisions on, what's the best way to help make these water quality improvements to the lake. So I guess just to wrap up, there's a really great opportunity here. We certainly can learn, utilize what we've learned here through this discovery and assessment phase. As we move into visioning and guiding principles, we'll kind of carry all this knowledge forward. And I'm really looking forward to our meeting coming up here and looking forward to hearing some of your input. Thank you all for your time and have a great evening. Thank you.